George Harrison was known to millions as the Quiet Beatle, a soft-spoken, spiritual figure who seemed worlds apart from the chaos of fame that surrounded the band. But behind that calm exterior was a man of deep convictions, sharp wit, and a fiery temper that few ever saw. Harrison could forgive many things, but when someone crossed him, whether in music, business, or his personal life, his resentment could last a lifetime. Fans often picture John Lennon as the outspoken one, Paul McCartney as the ambitious one, and Ringo Starr as the easygoing peacemaker. George? He was the mysterious one, the Beatle who often kept his true feelings hidden from the public. Yet those who knew him best say George's quiet nature could be deceiving. He wasn't passive. He wasn't weak. And when it came to certain people, George's dislike turned into outright hatred. This is the story of the man George Harrison utterly despised, a man whose relationship with George unraveled through betrayal, clashing egos, and wounds that time never fully healed. The Beatles may have been about love and peace on the surface, but beneath it all, Harrison's grudges tell us a very different story. George Harrison's image was crafted around mystery, unlike John Lennon, who thrived on controversy, or Paul McCartney, who openly embraced the spotlight. George seemed almost allergic to the circus of fame. Fans saw him as quiet, meditative, and detached, the Beatle most in touch with spirituality and the deeper meaning of life. But that public image only told part of the story. Beneath the calm exterior, Harrison carried a sharp tongue, a stubborn streak, and a fiery temper that few expected. Born in Liverpool in 1943, George grew up tough, the youngest of 4 children in a working-class family. By the time he joined the Beatles as their lead guitarist, he was barely a teenager. Surrounded by the towering personalities of Lennon and McCartney, Harrison was often sidelined, treated as the little brother of the band. That dynamic would shape his outlook for years. While John and Paul dominated the songwriting, George quietly built his skills, honing a style that combined raw emotion with precision. But the resentment of being overlooked was simmering even then. His frustration became more obvious as the Beatles grew into the most famous band in the world. Lennon and McCartney churned out hit after hit, controlling the band's creative direction, while George's songs were often dismissed or pushed aside. Tracks like While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Something later proved his genius. But in the early years, he fought tooth and nail to have his work recognized. George once remarked bitterly that he felt like an afterthought in his own band. That sense of being undervalued planted the seeds of a deep resentment that would follow him long after the Beatles split. But George's fire wasn't just about music. It was about principle. Unlike Paul, who had a gift for diplomacy, or John, who enjoyed chaos, George valued loyalty, honesty, and authenticity. Betray him, and forgiveness didn't come easily. This side of him surfaced not only in his business dealings, but also in his personal relationships. He expected sincerity from those around him, and when he sensed selfishness, betrayal, or manipulation, it cut him to the core. By the late 1960s, Harrison had already started to distance himself from the Beatles. The fame that once felt exciting had become suffocating, and the constant power struggle within the band exhausted him. Yet, as he stepped into his own voice, he also began to draw sharper lines between the people he could trust and the people he despised. This wasn't the gentle, forgiving man that fans often imagined. George could hold grudges for years, and he wasn't afraid to call out those who wronged him. In fact, some of the most intense conflicts of his life began during this period. Conflicts that revolved not around strangers, but around people who had once been his closest friends and collaborators. George Harrison may have been the quiet Beatle, but when his loyalty was betrayed, his silence spoke volumes. And when it came to one man in particular, George's silence turned into something darker, outright disdain. To understand the depth of George Harrison's grudges, we need to look at the people closest to him. Unlike Lennon or McCartney, George didn't scatter his anger widely. When he despised someone, it was usually for personal reasons, an intimate betrayal or a clash of values that cut too deep to ignore. And one of the most infamous examples of this came in his relationship with Eric Clapton. On paper, George and Eric should have been brothers in arms. Both were guitar virtuosos, both adored the blues, and both carried themselves with an intensity that separated them from the showbiz crowd. In fact, George and Clapton were so close that Eric even played the legendary guitar solo on Harrison's "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." Their friendship was genuine, at least at first, but behind the music was a love triangle that would push their bond to the breaking point. At the center of it all was Pattie Boyd, George's wife. She was the glamorous model who inspired some of the greatest songs in rock history, George's "Something" and Clapton's "Layla" among them. While George was deeply spiritual and searching for inner peace, his marriage was falling. Apart under the weight of his own infidelities and the pressures of fame, into that chaos stepped Clapton, who fell madly in love with Boyd. For George, it was the ultimate betrayal. This wasn't a rival in the music industry or a business executive trying to exploit the Beatles. This was his best friend coveting the woman he loved. To make matters worse, Clapton wasn't subtle about it. His obsession with Boyd was channeled directly into his music, with Layla practically serving as a confession of his feelings. The world could hear his longing, and so could George. The clash between the two wasn't just about romance, it was about principle. George believed in loyalty above all else. Clapton's actions cut him on a personal level, violating the trust he thought they shared. For a man like Harisson, who valued sincerity and authenticity, this wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Their friendship unraveled in a strange, public way. In interviews, George often spoke of the situation with a biting sarcasm, once even joking that Boyd could go with whoever she liked. But beneath the humor was a real bitterness. Though the Beatles had already fractured, this betrayal deepened George's growing sense that the people closest to him couldn't be trusted. Ironically, George and Clapton continued to work together musically, even after Pattie Boyd eventually left George and married Clapton. But the relationship was never the same. Behind the smiles and collaborations, there lingered a coldness, a wound that never fully healed. George may have maintained a facade of civility, but those who knew him understood that he carried that resentment for years. It was a perfect example of George's dual nature, the quiet, spiritual man who spoke of love and forgiveness, and the fiery, wounded soul who could despise someone who had crossed him. With Clapton, the clash of worlds was unavoidable. George's loyalty and sense of brotherhood ran headfirst into Eric's selfish obsession, leaving scars that even time couldn't erase. And yet Clapton wasn't the only one who faced George's fury. In the years following the Beatles' breakup, another figure emerged, someone who tested George's patience not through personal betrayal, but through artistic and professional clashes. A man whose very presence in the studio brought out Harrison's disdain. If Eric Clapton tested George Harrison's loyalty in his personal life, then Phil Spector tested it in his professional life. For Harisson, who valued discipline and sincerity, Spector's erratic behavior and chaotic working methods made him one of the most frustrating figures George ever dealt with, and, in time, someone he grew to despise. Phil Spector was already a legend when he entered the Beatles' orbit. Known for his wall of sound production style, Spector had revolutionized pop music in the 1960s. By 1970, with the Beatles falling apart, it was Spector who was brought in to salvage the Let It Be project. His heavy-handed production on the best songs like The Long and Winding Road enraged Paul McCartney, but George, at first, saw potential in him. When Harisson launched his solo career after the Beatles' breakup, he wanted to make a statement. His All Things Must Pass album was going to prove that he was more than just the third Beatle. For this ambitious triple record, he turned to Spector as co-producer. At first, the pairing seemed perfect. George brought the songs, and Spector brought the grandeur. But it didn't take long for George to realize that working with Spector came at a price. Spector was notoriously unreliable. He often showed up to sessions drunk, high, or not at all. Days of expensive studio time were wasted because Spector couldn't be found or was too intoxicated to function. For George, who had fought so hard to establish himself as a serious songwriter, this was maddening. He wasn't interested in wasting time or money. He wanted to work with focus and precision. Watching Spector spiral into chaos while his album hung in the balance was infuriating. Even when Spector was present, his methods clashed with George's vision. The producer's wall of sound was dense, echo-laden, and overwhelming, an approach that sometimes buried George's delicate melodies and spiritual lyrics under layers of instrumentation. George would later admit that he wasn't fully happy with how All Things Must Pass sounded, despite its critical and commercial success. He resented the fact that Spector's heavy hand had left fingerprints all over his most important solo statement. The breaking point came when Spector's behavior became too erratic to ignore. During the making of George's Concert for Bangladesh project in 1971, Spector's instability nearly derailed the entire effort. At one point, he reportedly showed up with a gun, threatening people in the studio. For a man like Harisson, who wanted the concert to be about peace, spirituality, and charity, this kind of behavior was intolerable. George later said he had to babysit Spector just to get him to work. The experience left Harisson deeply disillusioned. He felt betrayed, not in the same personal way as with Eric Clapton, but on an artistic and professional level. He had trusted Spector with his vision, only to see that trust sabotaged by recklessness and ego. From then on, George's patience with Spector wore thin, and eventually, he cut ties with him altogether. In interviews years later, George didn't hide his disdain. He described Spector as brilliant but impossible, a man who couldn't be relied upon when it mattered most. For Harisson, whose art was rooted in sincerity and discipline, Spector became a symbol of everything he couldn't stand: excess, chaos, and wasted potential. By the 1970s, George Harisson had learned a painful truth. Whether in friendship, love, or music, betrayal could come from the people you least expected. And when it came to Phil Spector, that betrayal turned into a deep, lasting resentment, one that Harisson never really let go of. By the late 1970s and into the decades that followed, George Harisson had settled into a very different rhythm of life. He was no longer competing with John and Paul for space on Beatles albums, no longer desperate to prove himself as a songwriter. With All Things Must Pass cementing his place as a solo artist, George shifted his focus away from the noise of the music industry and toward the things he loved most: gardening, family, spirituality, and the search for inner peace. Yet even in those quieter years, the scars from betrayal and frustration never fully disappeared. His relationship with Eric Clapton remained one of the most complicated chapters of his life. On the surface, they appeared to reconcile. George even joked about it publicly, once saying, "I'd rather she be with him than some dope." Clapton and Pattie Boyd eventually married, and remarkably, George remained friendly with them, even performing alongside Clapton years later. But those who knew Harisson best understood that the wound never completely healed. To George, loyalty was sacred, and the fact that his closest friend had crossed that line lingered in the background of their interactions, no matter how cordial they appeared. With Phil Spector, the fallout was different but equally lasting. George continued to voice his frustration about Spector's chaotic influence long after they stopped working together. When discussing All Things Must Pass, Harisson admitted that while he loved the songs, he regretted how heavy and cluttered the production had become. It was a subtle but clear rebuke of Spector's approach. By the time Spector's personal life unraveled in scandal decades later, George's early disdain for him seemed almost prophetic. But here's the paradox. While Harisson could carry bitterness, he also sought spiritual growth through forgiveness. His devotion to Indian philosophy and the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita constantly pulled him toward letting go of anger. Friends often described him as a man at war with himself, torn between the fiery Liverpudlian with a sharp tongue and the meditative seeker striving for enlightenment. This duality defined George in his later years. Even near the end of his life, Harisson didn't shy away from speaking honestly about those he disliked. Unlike Paul, who often softened his stories. For diplomacy, or John, who leaned into theatrics, George's reflections were cutting but measured. He didn't rant, he didn't exaggerate. He simply spoke his truth. Whether it was about feeling like an outsider in the Beatles, losing Patty to Clapton, or enduring Spector's chaos, George never pretended those experiences didn't sting, and yet his legacy is not one of bitterness, but of resilience. The man who utterly despised certain figures in his life also produced music filled with love, faith, and hope. Songs like Here Comes the Sun and Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth reveal the other side of Harisson, the man who sought healing even when old wounds lingered. George Harrison's story reminds us that even the quietest souls can carry the heaviest grudges. His life was a testament to the idea that spirituality doesn't erase pain, it helps us live with it. And while he may have despised certain men for what they did to him, he never allowed that hatred to define his art. Instead, he transformed his battles into music that continues to inspire millions around the world.